shifting from Asia and Europe over to our side, the colonial genocides. Do you think of the Spanish conquest, and of course, it wasn't just the Spanish, but the conquest of South and Central America as maybe the single greatest genocide of them all? If we're maybe you would object to that sort of measuring of them, but maybe you could trace out how you would think about this situation.
It is certainly a tragedy of major proportions. I mean, major proportions. And, whether it's numerically the most or not, I wouldn't want to venture to guess. But, some people have suggested, 90 million people, 80 million people lost their lives as a result of the Spanish conquest, that century, of essentially the 16th century, and it was a terrible destruction of human life. And I decided, looking at that piece of history, I more or less thought to myself, well, this absolutely belongs in the history of genocide. Because what happens is, again, mostly for, in this case, material reasons. I mean, the Spanish are trying to get money, silver, gold, precious jewels, and also exploit labor in order to get the products of these mines. The Spanish end up, killing is a hard word here, because a lot of times they end up infecting the native peoples of the region, with germs. I mean, some people have called it a germ genocide or that kind of thing. They bacteriological genocide, because they bring with them all kinds of disease. And there's probably 90% of the people die of disease and exposure and hunger. I mean, there's a lot of hunger involved as well. The native peoples. And the Spanish inflict terrible losses on the native peoples, also through military campaigns. So yes, I think about it as a horrible genocide where tens of millions of people, were destroyed by this conquest. And as you know, if you read the book, then there's this wonderful priest, De las Casas, who observes and criticizes what's going on, and his observations are devastating, about what the Spanish are doing. And there's an argument among the Spanish, are they human? Are the people there who are dying human or not? And many of the churchmen say, no, they're not. They're not human. And De las Casas is one who argues, yes, they are human. And they can be, which means they can be converted to Catholicism. The others say, no, they're somewhere between apes and humans. And therefore they can't even be converted. So let's not bother. We can exploit them like you exploit animals, like oxen. You hook them up to a yoke and they do the work for you. And that argument, went on during the entire Spanish occupation. But the reality, of course, the argument went on back in Spain. But the reality on the ground is you exploit if you can exploit. And they did. They really exploited the native population and drove them into the ground.
Right. Now, this are they human question, it resonates all throughout the colonial genocides, from the United States to Australia and the Aborigines, Africa and the Sand Bushmen, and on and on. But first, and not at all as if this is unrelated, another component of genocide that we haven't discussed yet really is slavery. And what role did this play in the Spanish genocide? And then, since we've been taking a very diachronic, to use that word again, perspective on things, has slavery often been a part of genocide historically? And this goes back to the are they human question.
I think the answer to that is a complicated one. It's not as easy. Because if you put people in slavery, as we did, for example, in the United States, right? The African population that was brought over and put in manacles and put to work, right? You want them to work. You want to feed them enough so they can work. You want to keep them alive enough so they can work. You want to have them procreate enough so that their children who grow up and work. And, that's part of the story of slavery. So slaves, I'd never get involved in the argument there's anything good about slavery. But it's not the same thing as genocide. In the Spanish case, I think they were less interested in slavery than they were in control of these people and using them then in ways that they wanted. Sometimes as slaves, sometimes as forced labor, sometimes as indentured labor on the land, sometimes, in different. So there's not an institution, in other words, of slavery where all of the, Central American and South American native peoples were, you are now slave versus free man, but you are now, a subhuman dependent upon your Spanish rulers. And the result is much different. In other words, in the case of the Central Americans, South Americans, who were put to work, in the mines and on the enconadas and in various institutions that the Spanish created to create economic wealth. These peoples were died in various ways. And that from the Spanish point of view, it wasn't that you fed them more, but that you kept them alive, but you just replaced them with more. There was a sense that there was an inexhaustible quantity of people who could do this job or do these jobs. And so, they just went through the population until, by the way, they ended up not having enough people. So by the end of the century, they started bringing in African slaves or Africans to work to take the place of the native peoples, the indigenous peoples of the region, who were no longer available, for this kind of work. So, and that ended up then, encouraging the slave trade in this region. And maybe then later, the slaves were not destroyed in the way the native peoples were destroyed. They were just wiped out. The Tainos, people in the Caribbean, they're totally wiped out. They're almost completely. It's interesting. You can't completely wipe out a people. It doesn't ever quite happen in genocide, even if that's your goal, your intent. But, the Tainos, for all practical purposes, several 100,000 of them were killed or died under Spanish rule, including, by the way, Christopher Columbus, who was not very gentle with the Tainos either.
Zooming out again for a little bit, what do you identify as, or if there are any, key differences between the colonial or the settler or colonial, as we've been referring to them, genocides, and then the ones we've already discussed? And one thing I found interesting when reading was there are often secular justifications in terms of race, and then the British conception of property rights, which I'd never really thought about, that those who tilled and worked the land owned it, which many of the indigenous cultures did not do as part of their manner of life.
Well, I think that's characteristic, this kind of 17th century idea, British idea of property and who gets to farm and that kind of thing, who owns the land, who has right to the land, does spread out with colonial empires. And it's quite clear that the indigenous peoples who have, various forms of economy. I mean, it's not as if they're all hunter-gatherers. I mean, some of them have, very well-developed local economies, but don't have well-developed ideas of property rights. And even when they do, they tend to be rolled over by the colonial authorities anyway, who don't recognize those forms of property rights. So, so you have these colonial peoples coming in and seizing the land as theirs and not recognizing the rights of the indigenous peoples and not even thinking about kind of their cultural way of dealing with the economy or the various nomadic lifestyles or whatever is there, moving your herds from one place to another. You think that those are your grasslands, right? But that's not how the ranchers thought about it in North America or in South Africa or anywhere. So, this property rights issue is a huge one, but it's overlaid then with race. And, the beginnings of really strong racial thinking, which happens, by the way, already with the Spanish in South America. And, this notion that these are inferior peoples, not just that they can't deal with property properly, but that they're not, as I was saying, fully human, or that they're lesser humans, even if you recognize their humanity, even if you recognize that they can be converted, for example. They're still not quite the same. And therefore, they can be expropriated. Their land can be taken from them. They can be shot and killed or murdered. So, the settler genocide is extremely widespread phenomenon. I mean, it's very interesting in the historiography that the scholars didn't pay a lot of attention to this until the turn of this century. It's really been fairly recent. I mean, there was a lot of stuff that came out, the 70s, 80s, 90s of the last century about American Indians and how they'd been exploited and that kind of thing. But it was all very kind of political and excessive and overwrought. And the real scholarship, was really with this century. Started by a group of English and Australian historians, British historians, a couple people in South Africa, a couple people in the United States who started, doing very serious work on what happened to the indigenous peoples. And, there was a book, I can't remember when it was published exactly. I'm going to guess 2008, something like that, by this guy, Benjamin Madley, who's at UCLA, called California Genocide. And, it shows that what happened with the tribes in California is that they were systematically killed, with the data and with modern, all kinds of good archival materials that demonstrate his point of view, creating new knowledge, as we talked about earlier on,
fresh knowledge
about what happened to the California tribes. And, it was only a few years ago, I was at the ceremony in Sacramento where the governor got up and said in front of a group of California tribes, genocide happened to you, and we're really sorry about it. I mean, he didn't have a real program for dealing with that observation, but at least he made the observation. And we're talking about not very many years ago, right? When in point of fact these things happened in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. So we're talking much more than a century ago, and it's only in our own century that this has been recognized in a kind of substantial way. And I'm sure for the tribes, for the Native Americans in California, it's not recognized enough, and not compensated enough for.